In the mid-20th century, the United States systematically scrapped over 100,000 steam locomotives in what became one of the largest industrial purges in history. Most Americans never knew it happened. More than 100,000 steam locomotives vanished from America's rails in less than a decade, a number so vast it demands proof, not just legend. To understand how this figure holds up, researchers have traced three layers of documentary evidence. First, the corporate ledgers, daily registers from the major railroads listing each engine's serial number, the date it left service, and its final fate, scrapped, stored, or occasionally sold. These ledgers, preserved in archives from Penn State to the Union Pacific Museum, provide the raw withdrawal counts, often flagged with codes like HFD or retired. Next come the Interstate Commerce Commission filings. Every time a railroad wanted to remove a locomotive from its books, it had to file an official docket with the ICC, marking the legal end of that machine's career. These dockets, stored on microfilm and now digitized in the National Archives, create a second government-verified record. But a locomotive could be retired on paper long before it was actually cut up. The third layer is the scrapyard invoice, the physical receipt for destruction. Steel companies like Bethlehem and Kaiser kept detailed purchase orders, noting how many tons of metal each engine yielded and the price paid. When all three records, withdrawal, legal disposition, and scrapyard invoice line up, the count is solid. Cross-referencing these sources, historians consistently land above the 100,000 mark for steam engines scrapped between 1945 and 1955. This is not a rough guess or a myth repeated in railfan circles. It is a cumulative total, built engine by engine, ledger by ledger, and invoice by invoice. The true scale only becomes clear when the paperwork is stacked together, revealing just how thoroughly the old iron giants were erased. In the years just after World War II, steam locomotives stood at the heart of American life. The nation's railroads operated a fleet that reached its all-time peak, over 32,000 steam engines, according to the Interstate Commerce Commission's annual reports. These machines weren't just moving freight and passengers, they were the backbone of a vast industrial system. Every major city, small town, and rural junction depended on the constant pulse of steam to deliver coal, grain, manufactured goods, and people from coast to coast. Behind every locomotive was an army of workers, engineers, firemen, machinists, boilermakers, each with skills honed over decades. Entire communities grew up around the roundhouses and repair shops. In places like Altoona, Pennsylvania, or Roanoke, Virginia, the local economy depended on the steady rhythm of engine overhaul and maintenance. The shops themselves were sprawling complexes, filled with the clang of steel and the hiss of steam, employing thousands. The scale of this operation was staggering. The Association of American Railroads tracked not just the locomotives, but the infrastructure that supported them: coaling towers, water tanks, turntables, and a network of supply depots stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. By the mid-1940s, steam power moved more than 80% of all rail freight in the country. These engines were built to be repaired, rebuilt, and kept running for generations, embodying a kind of industrial self-sufficiency that touched every corner of the nation. What stood to be lost was more than just a mode of transport. It was a living system, woven into the fabric of American industry and community. Oil executives did not just wait for railroads to come calling. In the late 1940s, petroleum companies launched a quiet but focused campaign aimed at the people who controlled railroad budgets. Instead of public ads, they funded seminars at business schools, Harvard, Wharton, and Stanford, inviting railroad chief financial officers and board members to closed-door sessions. The rosters from these events read like a who's who of railroad finance. Names from the Pennsylvania, Union Pacific, and Santa Fe railroads appear alongside Standard Oil and Gulf Oil executives. The message was simple and relentless. Diesel fuel, not coal, would power the future, and the numbers could prove it. Commissioned studies from academic consultants arrived on railroad desks, each packaged as an energy economics brief. These reports did not dwell on technical specs or mechanical reliability. Instead, they framed the choice as a matter of fiscal responsibility: lower operating ratios, faster depreciation, less labor, more profit. Oil-funded analysts argued that dieselization was not just an upgrade, it was a necessity for survival in a changing market. The strategy worked. By the early 1950s, railroad boardrooms echoed with the language of return on investment and cost per ton mile, concepts that had been sharpened at those oil-sponsored seminars. Manufacturers soon followed with their own sales offensives, but the ground had already shifted. The narrative, shaped behind closed doors, was no longer about engines or engineering. It was about dollars, and oil companies had written the script. Inside the boardrooms of post-war America, the diesel pitch was less about horsepower and more about spreadsheets. General Motors' Locomotive division, already dominating the diesel market, sent teams of sales engineers armed with internal memos and financial tables. Their target was not the chief mechanical officer. It was the finance department. EMD's pitch laid out a promise few railroads could ignore: trade in your steam fleet and receive not only a new diesel locomotive but a suite of incentives designed to make the numbers irresistible. The offer included generous trade-in credits for each retired steam engine, often bundled with bulk order discounts and extended payment terms. But the real lure was spelled out in the return on equity tables. EMD's 1951 corporate report boasted a 269% return on plant and equipment, a figure that dwarfed the modest margins of steam. The memos circulated to railroad chief financial officers highlighted not just lower fuel and labor costs, but a sharply reduced maintenance schedule, faster depreciation, and a 5-year payback period. Sales literature included side-by-side comparisons, with diesel's projected profits far outpacing steam's dwindling returns. Manufacturers were not simply selling machines, they were selling a financial future. The message was clear: order now, retire your steam fleet, and watch your balance sheet transform. As these packages landed on railroad desks, purchase orders followed in rapid succession. The boardroom calculus had shifted, and the path to dieselization was paved with promises of higher returns and lower risk. Congress didn't simply watch from the sidelines as railroads debated their future. In 1950, lawmakers rewrote the tax code to favor diesel power, introducing a 5-year accelerated depreciation schedule for new diesel locomotives. Under this rule, railroads could write off the cost of a diesel unit in just 5 years. Triple the speed allowed for steam engines, which still sat on a 15-year schedule. This wasn't a hidden loophole. It was spelled out in black and white statutory language, tailor-made for the industry's biggest capital expense. The Internal Revenue Code Section 168 became the lever that pried open railroad budgets, turning what had been a daunting upfront investment into a manageable, government-subsidized cost. The practical effect was immediate. A railroad that bought a diesel in 1951 could deduct a huge chunk of its cost from taxable income almost right away, slashing the true price by as much as 30%. Diesel orders soared. Finance officers who had just sat through oil-sponsored seminars on return on investment now saw the numbers line up perfectly with federal incentives. The 5-year window made it nearly impossible for steam to compete on paper, no matter how well a locomotive performed in the real world. The government's nudge was more than a suggestion. It was a catalyst, making the mass retirement of steam not just possible, but financially irresistible. September 1953 stands out as a month unlike any other in the history of American railroading. Interstate Commerce Commission records show 2,751 separate retirement filings for steam locomotives in just those 30 days, a record spike that dwarfed every previous tally. Railroads from the Pennsylvania to the Union Pacific submitted stacks of withdrawal dockets, each one a legal death certificate for a machine that might have been in the service only a few years earlier. The filings arrived in batches, sometimes hundreds at a time, with no public announcement and little fanfare. Numbers that had crept upward for years suddenly shot off the charts. The Interstate Commerce Commission's own monthly registers, now digitized in the National Archives, reveal how abrupt the change really was. In a single month, nearly 3% of the remaining steam fleet vanished from the official books. Railroad executives, acting under pressure from finance departments and federal incentives, signed off on mass retirements with a speed that left little room for public debate or technical review. There was no engineering trial, no last-ditch evaluation of advanced steam. Instead, the paperwork moved in a wave, each docket a silent order to erase another piece of the country's industrial backbone. The true shock comes not just from the numbers, but from how quietly and efficiently this purge was carried out, with the full machinery of regulation and corporate accounting working in lockstep. Rows of steam locomotives, some barely a decade old, lined up in the shadows of sprawling scrapyards across the Midwest and Northeast. Here, the final chapter wasn't written in ledgers or ICC filings, but in the hiss of oxyacetylene torches and the grind of shears tearing through steel. Each engine represented about 150 tons of metal, enough iron and copper to fill entire rail cars. Scrapyard operators like Bethlehem Steel and Kaiser Steel processed purchase orders by the trainload, each invoice listing serial numbers, weights, and the price per ton. In the early 1950s, a railroad could expect to receive $30 to $45 per ton, turning the remains of a single locomotive into a check worth several $1,000s. That money was often routed straight into the purchase of new diesel units. The process was relentless. Engines rolled in under their own steam or towed dead, stripped of fittings, and cut down to boiler shells and frame. By nightfall, nothing remained but piles of scrap and a stack of receipts. For the scrappers, this was a boom time. For the railroads, it was a way to convert obsolete assets into ready capital. The destruction wasn't just practical, it was profitable, fueling the next round of diesel orders and binding the industry ever tighter to the new system. The old machines, built to be rebuilt, were instead reduced to raw material, their value measured only by the ton. In 1949, the Pennsylvania Railroad's Altoona Test Laboratory published a report that would become a touchstone in the steam versus diesel debate. Engineers there ran side-by-side trials, measuring not just horsepower, but the daily realities of fuel use, maintenance hours, and crew requirements. The numbers told a story that was less clear-cut than the marketing pitches. On average, diesel electrics burned about 30% less coal-equivalent fuel per ton-mile compared to the latest steam designs. More striking was the difference in maintenance. Diesels needed only about 20% as many labor hours to stay in service, freeing up shop crews and slashing overtime payrolls. But the lab notebooks also captured what the sales brochures left out. Several advanced steam prototypes, like PRR's T1 duplex and the Norfolk and Western's Class A, matched or even outperformed diesels in raw tractive effort and could be rebuilt in-house with domestic parts. The real gap, Altoona's engineers noted, lay in the relentless grind of daily upkeep. Steam's complex boilers, fireboxes, and running gear demanded constant attention, while diesels ran longer between overhauls and required fewer specialized skills. These findings circulated through the ICC's annual freight train performance reports and landed on the desks of railroad executives. The numbers became ammunition for both sides. Diesel advocates pointed to labor and fuel savings, while steam loyalists argued that with proper investment, modern steam could have closed the gap. The Altoona data did not end the debate. It deepened it, revealing that the choice was not just about engineering, but about who controlled the economics of American railroading. Once railroads signed on the dotted line for new diesel fleets, there was no easy way back. The financial glue was the equipment trust, a legal contract that bound a railroad to its locomotive purchases for a full decade. Trust documents from the Pennsylvania Railroad T1 program spell it out. Engines financed under a 10-year trust could not be scrapped, sold, or even mothballed until the term expired. The result was a strange limbo. Brand new steam locomotives, sidelined by the rush to diesel, sat idle but untouchable, draining maintenance budgets while the railroads waited for the clock to run out. Only when the trust expired, often in the mid-1950s, could these engines be legally cut up and the proceeds rolled into diesel orders. But the lock-in did not stop with finance. As dieselization swept through, the supply chain pivoted overnight. Parts suppliers who had built their business on steam, makers of injectors, air compressors, lubricators, either switched to diesel components or closed up shop. By 1952, spare parts for advanced steam engines became scarce and expensive, forcing railroads to cannibalize stored engines just to keep a handful running. The maintenance shops that once rebuilt steam power from the ground up now found themselves unable to source even basic fittings. Every new diesel purchase, every closed parts contract, made a return to steam less practical and more costly. The system was locked in, not just by investment, but by a vanishing industrial ecosystem. The door to a future with modern steam was not just closed, it was welded shut. In Altoona, Pennsylvania, the end came not with a bang, but with a slow unraveling. The Juniata shops, once the largest locomotive repair complex in America, had filled the city with the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam for generations. By 1955, the last steam overhaul was finished, and 8,000 jobs disappeared almost overnight. Census records trace the fallout. Altoona's population dropped from over 47,000 in 1940 to less than 39,000 by 1960, with nearly a third of the workforce gone in just 5 years. The story repeated itself in Roanoke, Virginia, where the Norfolk and Western steam shops had once anchored the local economy. When the division closed, Roanoke's population shrank by more than a third. In Lima, Ohio, the shutdown of the Lima Locomotive Works erased not just paychecks, but the identity of a town built on steam. School enrollments faded, property tax rolls shrank, storefronts emptied. For the machinists and boilermakers, there was no easy transition. Their skills, honed for the intricate guts of a steam engine, suddenly had no place in the new diesel order. The human toll, measured in lost livelihoods and hollowed-out towns, was as stark as the vanished engines themselves. Newspapers in the early 1950s painted the switch to diesel as an unstoppable march forward. Headlines like "Railroads Enter the Diesel Age" ran above stories celebrating cleaner engines, faster schedules, and the supposed end of old-fashioned breakdowns. Trade journals echoed the same theme, quoting railroad executives who called steam a relic and diesel the future. Yet this narrative left out a crucial fact. Not every industrialized nation was racing to erase steam. In Britain, for example, government policy kept coal cheap and delayed mass diesel orders for years. The last new mainline steam locomotive, the Evening Star, rolled out of Swindon Works in 1960, 7 years after most American railroads had already sent their steam fleets to the torch. Regular British steam service continued until 1968, a full decade longer than in the U.S. British policy documents from the late 1950s show no panic to dieselise, and press coverage there often questioned whether the new technology truly delivered on its promises. The contrast is sharp. While American headlines cheered on diesel's rise as inevitable, British debates lingered over cost, coal supply, and the value of proven machines. The story of steam's disappearance in America was not written by fate alone. It was shaped by choices, some public, some hidden, about who would profit, what skills would survive, and how much of the past was worth saving. Today, the wreckage of 100,000 steam locomotives lies buried beneath decades of progress narratives. As industries automate and communities vanish, the real question is who shapes our technological future and who gets left behind. When powerful interests dictate what survives, innovation and self-reliance become casualties. The story isn't about what we lost, it's about how easily we can lose what matters most. What do you think? Share your perspective below.